Good morning. Can you hear me?
Oh, hello. Hi there. Hi, Lawrence.
Hi, how you doing?
Not too bad. Yourself?
Not so bad. Yeah, not so bad. The weather's a little bit better today here. I don't know what it was like where you guys are. I'm sort of in the East Midlands. It was terrible yesterday. So it's a little bit better today. So that's something.
Great news. I'm in Scotland and it's absolutely peeing it down at the moment.
Really?
So it's really,
Well,
heavy.
I spent 7 years in Edinburgh, so I know that east side of Scotland, but Scotland in general, isn't it, is it's pretty wet compared to England. Morning,
It's
Jane.
wet in Cornwall as well today.
Is it? I'm getting a weather forecast from all over the UK here.
Oh, very good.
This is cool. Good morning, Jane.
Good morning.
So we're expecting, I had a look this morning, hitherto we were 6. I think we're expecting 7, Jane. And I think we're all here, or maybe bar 1, because there's 9 then, isn't there? Which is really good, actually, to have 8 at this stage. It's only just after 11.
Yeah, very good.
That's very good.
I'm feeling like I'm a bit shadowy today.
Yeah, I'm going to close the window as I did. Close the curtains, Jane. I won't be a second.
Okay. Really bad. Kind of weird.
I can certainly see you a little bit better, Jane.
Yeah, good. I've pulled the screen down a little bit. So I think we might as well proceed, Lawrence.
Yes, I think we're only missing 1. So that's great. So I'm just going to share the screen. And my usual question, share, just if you can shout out if you can see this.
It's something's not quite right.
Something's not quite right. I've got to actually do presenter view. Where are we? Here we go. Play from start.
There we go.
Can you see that?
Yes.
Brilliant. Should I kick off then, Jane? I usually kick off about 5 after the hour. So shall I kick off?
Yeah, so just to say that I'm co-hosting with Lawrence. I'm here on the chat box answering questions or indeed posing questions to Lawrence at appropriate junctures throughout the session. So yeah, over to you, Lawrence.
Okay. Now my pointer was working. I'm just going to, I don't know why it does this when we're all okay, it doesn't seem to want to work again. It was working earlier. I must figure this out. Okay, so hopefully you are all here to hear a talk about basically the registers RSci and RSci Tech. Now, you notice from the screen that this is part 2. So by implication, there is a part 1. So specifically what we're going to be talking about today, and I'll elaborate on this in a second, is we're going to be talking about examples of competencies that I've accrued through my own experience and my experience as being an assessor that you can reflect upon and recapitulate or mirror when you fill in your own competency reports, okay? What we're not going to be talking about is the mechanics of applying and CAP and the benefits of registration. That's part 1, but that part 1 talk, if you haven't thus far been to it, is actually available as an archive, as part of my profile on the Science Council website, which Jane can direct you to. So, just a little bit about me. I know some of you are becoming familiar with me. So my name's Lawrence Dawkins-Hall. I'm actually a chartered scientist myself, which is one of the reasons I'm eligible to be an applicant support mentor for the Science Council. I also have this sister award called Chartered Biologist. This is really a biomedical science biased chartered scientist. It's awarded in the case of biology by the Royal Society of Biology, so it's a society-based award. There are equivalent awards such as chartered chemists that are offered by RSC. What I'd say at the outset and then sort of dismiss this subject is these particular awards that are subject biased are actually quite useful if you want to become more involved with the licensed bodies that fall under the aegis of the Science Council itself. But what we're going to be talking about today are basically the other registers to CSI, which is RSci and RSci Tech. It's these scientists, general scientist registers, that are the ones that in terms of career and national importance and transcend subject and thus fall under the umbrella of the Science Council in general, they're the ones that really matter. And so I'm not going to say anything more about chartered biologist. Also, just to mention that I'm very actively involved with the Institute of Science and Technology, which is one of the licensed bodies of the Science Council. And so I'm not just a member, which I was when I joined. You'll all obviously join, or you may have joined one of the licensed bodies as sort of explained in part 1. I'm actually a fellow, and the reason I mention that is because I run workshops similar to this for the IST, but I'm also, or I have been for the last 3 years, an assessor for the IST, okay? I actually look at competency reports. So from my point of view, consider basically this workshop the beginning of the journey, not the end. My remit, as Jane likes me to point out, as an applicant support mentor for the Science Council, is to basically give these workshops and then to walk away. However, of my own volition, I don't like to do that. If you have any questions subsequent to this Zoom session, or in fact, if you want me to assist you or mentor you with your competency answers based on what you assimilate today, I'm happy to do that. It's not part of my role, but I do it. And one of the things I'd say is, as an assessor for 3 years for the Institute of Science and Technology and latterly the Science Council, I'm very well versed to actually advise you, notwithstanding my mentoring role and my own chartered scientist. I'm very well placed to advise you on what constitutes a good, or as I put it, competent competency answer. And that is something we're going to be talking about today. Okay, so to basically conclude this opening gambit, based on what I've said, any sort of competency specific, registration specific questions, direct those at me at the Science Council email address. If, however, you have general questions pertaining to CAP or licensed bodies in general, please direct those at the Senior Professional Registration Officer for the Science Council, Hayley McNeil. Hayley, I describe Hayley as the gatekeeper of registration, and she can deal with any sort of miscellaneous queries you have, whereas technical queries related to the report itself, drop me a line or maybe drop Jane a line. And then to conclude this slide, I'm just going to show you this. The application portal itself, CAP, is actually rooted in the SurveyMonkey platform. And I've put this on not so much to advertise or make the point that it is SurveyMonkey. This is actually a hyperlink. So if at some point through Jane, through going to my profile on the Science Council website, you obtain a copy of my actual talk, this talk, and I'll show you my archive in a minute, then you can actually commence your application from this hyperlink on the opening slide. So if we just elaborate a little bit on really the objectives of today. So as I've mentioned, we're going to define the competencies. And really, when I say competencies, we're talking about A to D. E1 is really an adjunct of part of D. E2 is really CPD. So I don't really cover it in this presentation. So CPD is not being covered today. So I'm going to give you competency examples relating to A, D1, and by extension, D, and by extension, E1. Then there's going to be an opportunity for you to offer me, reflecting on what I've shown you, any examples you can think of your own. And we'll just discuss those in a group forum. If, however, you don't want to do that, you can actually just drop me a question through the chat line and the chat function, and Jane is very good at keeping an eye on those as I present, and then periodically gets me to answer those questions. So those questions on chat will be answered ad hoc. Okay, so there's really two more, basically three, I should say three more bits to the talk. The main thing is the competency examples, and I think that's probably the main reason you're here. So having given you examples, how do you actually go about writing a good answer? So I'm going to, as a mentor, as a CSI myself, but perhaps of paramount significance, my role as an assessor over 3 years, I'm going to tell you what constitutes a good answer. Okay. Then there's going to be a little bit of what you might call an addendum. That's really the main talk. There will be an addendum where we talk about what happens beyond submission of your competency report and other things via CAP. It's more than a competency report, but that's really not the subject of today's discussion. That's part one. And then we're going to basically, in my role as mentor, I'm going to talk or at least illustrate to you registrant standards that the Science Council expects of incumbent and upcoming registrants. So just a little bit about me. I've mentioned the fact that I'm here in my capacity as an applicant support mentor for the Science Council. But my actual day job is I'm a biomedical sciences, life sciences technician. So I've got a lot of experience relating to these things. I also do other things as well, as I've mentioned, such as edit, instruct, assess, I CPD train. And so I know quite a lot about the process of applying. I mention my own experience because obviously if you are a biomedical scientist and you submit an application, I'm going to basically have inside knowledge of what you do and acronyms, etc. But let me make this clear that, you know, although in general, competency is synonymous with STEM subjects and biomedical scientists tend to dominate, that isn't to say that I'm not capable of actually commenting on the answers of, say, physical scientists, geographers, archaeologists, because the whole point of this is it's not subject specific. It's not an academic qualification. This is not about subject knowledge. It's about generic skills and scenarios that illustrate those generic skills, as we'll come on to. So given that it is generic, I am more than capable of commenting or mentoring a competency form that, say, comes from a geologist. So keep that in mind. So I mentioned the fact that I am here in my capacity as a support mentor for the Science Council. This is actually a little bit about me that I've just alluded to in the last slide. The reason I'm showing you this is because this has an archive of today's talk, which is this one here. If any of you think following this or based on your own sort of inclinations, and I know there are one or two that have said this to me, that in fact you might be CSI. We haven't got time today to delineate the 3 registers. Once again, that's part of the part 1. And here is the part 1 talk here. And this is actually a link to this profile of mine, and thus by extension, my 3 principal talks. So this is really just to set the scene. We talk in a lot more detail about this. We break it down iteratively in part 1. I've actually this time applied a link to this slide, applying for registration, which gives a lot of detail on the Science Council website about each of these stages of application, which are covered in part 1. So essentially, you are here today because you think you're either RSI Tech, you're equivocating, so you're not sure. So hopefully if I do my job by the end of today, you'll know. You might even think you're CSI. There are essentially 2 routes to application. One is the full written report. Another is a slimline version of the report, followed by a face-to-face interview. Now, the pros and cons of that, once again, I haven't got time to go into. That is the subject of part 1. So if you're interested in knowing more, contact Hayley or look at my part 1 talk where I break that down quite a lot. This is really the meat of today's talk, considering examples of meeting your competencies, okay, which I will give you and let you comment on yourself. And then finally, you can do this before you apply for professional registration, join a licensed body. If you haven't done so, you can actually do it in conjunction with your main CAP application. And this is obviously having done that, or should I say to do that, you go through the Common Application Portal or CAP using, for example, the link I've provided on the home page of this slide. Just to set the scene, I just really want to give a basic overview. This is not strictly the subject of today's talk, but it puts things in context. I want to give you a basic overview of the difference between RSci and RSci Tech in very generic and very sort of basic terms. So an RSci Tech essentially is someone that can work independently in the sense that they can follow prescribed SOPs. However, they don't devise those SOPs, and generally speaking, they're not involved with training others, okay? So they're competent in terms of techniques they already know and have been trained in. If you contrast that with an RSci essentially is somebody that essentially is built on RSci Tech experience. And crucially, the main difference, I would say, in my experience, is they are actually able to troubleshoot problems with protocols. They don't need to confer. They can actually work things out for themselves. In addition, they may have other responsibilities, such as basically maintaining equipment, optimizing protocols for equipment. But I think crucially, one of the differences you'd expect between an RSci and an RSci Tech is that RSIs are training people, devising health and safety forms. RSci Tech are following the instructions from senior people. So in general, an RSci Tech will have 1 year plus experience in a professional working environment. They're not rookies because they are competent and they're independent with regard to prescribed SOPs. So they're not completely new. An RSI generally has 2 or more years experience, which allows them to be a little bit more independent, as I've mentioned, and train others. And in fact, I've provided a link. I've provided a link to basically a delineation of the registers, which is on the Science Council website. If you're not sure, I'd encourage you to use that. There's a lot of excellent material on the Science Council website that I would really encourage you all to look at. I want to stress the fact that the registers in general, they're not academic qualifications. They are essentially accreditation of skills, okay? Academic qualifications are about subject knowledge. This is about subject knowledge linked to technical skills, but other sorts of skills as well that are brought out in the other competencies we'll discuss, particularly B2D. So basically, one of the things that gets said in terms of the level, the competency level in terms of professional practice you work on, is that RSci Tech are working at a level 3 or above. This is A levels. RSci level 5 or level 6, level 5 is HND, and level 6 is a degree. We won't mention 3 because that's not the remit of today's talk. But what I want to mention with this is it doesn't matter if you don't have A levels, HND, or a degree. To be fair, many technicians do. They come out and they gain their professional experience post-university. Post HND, but not everybody, because that would preclude, for example, a lot of old school teaching technicians that come in at 16 and work their way up. So it's not about academic qualifications per se. It's actually about skills that are commensurate with that level of qualification. So even if you do not have A levels, HND, or degree, you can still become an RSci Tech and an RSci. Okay, so completing your competency report. This, I believe, is why most of you are here. So if we actually define what competencies are, simply put, you have the skills that enable you to do all aspects of your job effectively. Okay, so this is skill accreditation. And I want to point you to the fact that it says all aspects, because this is not just about being able to proficiently carry out technical experiments. It's about other things as well, such as the way you communicate, the way you teach others. So it looks at all of your skills. It looks at your job description, your practice thereof holistically. So essentially what we have is it breaks those down into 5. And as I say, we are going to focus on the first 4. E1 is synonymous in part with D. So it's really A to D that we're going to talk about today. If there is something that actually, shall we say, incorporates your scientific knowledge, it's it's competency A. So competency A is about the application of specialist knowledge and skills. So in this competency, when you're filling out your form, you have the opportunity to talk a little bit about the science you do. You can talk shop, okay? The others, however, are to do with non-technical skills, how you organize your time, how you plan, how you work with others, how you solve problems, how you communicate effectively with different groups of people, scientists and non-scientists alike. So let me reiterate the fact that basically the competency report is about accrediting all skills that you bring to bear in your everyday job. You are definitely more than somebody that just pipettes at the bench or uses a piece of automated kit. So if we were to basically split in a sort of schematic way groups of competencies and what people generally at RSci and RSci Tech are doing. So unlike CSci, most people who are RSci or RSci Tech, they're doing different things, a plethora of roles, but they tend to be, when they're not on computers analyzing data in the office, they tend to be based in labs, okay? So they're basically experimenting, they're supporting students, they're supporting postdocs, okay? And those relate to competencies A, B, C, and D, as I'll say. Obviously, with the experimental side of things, whether you're doing that independently as an RSci or conferring when you hit problems as an RSci Tech, that relates to A, as we've just outlined, okay? But of course, there are many other things that both RSci Techs and RSci do. And principal among those is obviously to keep the lab running for other people. Lab housekeeping in the case of RSci Tech, or lab management, a little bit more organization of others. So it's more lab managers. But many, many people who work in labs are doing things like maintaining the equipment, stock taking and ordering as well. These are ubiquitous functions in labs, okay? So they tend to be the subject, amongst others, of competencies B, C, and D. But oh, and the other thing I should say is that it isn't just about pipetting at the bench. It's actually, most labs today are full of boxes. Most labs today are very automated. They're not like the old school chemistry labs that I remember, and you probably do as well. It's a lot of very complex bits of machinery. So of course, maintenance of those, upkeep of those, improving the protocols, those all feed into your competencies in addition to traditional style bench experiments, okay? And finally, part of what the form looks at is how you balance these issues, how you plan your work, how you actually intercalate these two sets of duties and more. And they are the subject in part of competencies B and D, time management and planning. So let me just say, in terms of the competencies in general, as a general sweep, one competency can be used to create a single narrative. So as I'll show, each competency is broken down into 3 sub-competencies, and you can use one subject to create a single narrative. Conversely, you can use one theme, such as communication, such as addressing standards, to address multiple narratives. And what I'd say, yes.
Can I come in here with a question? Because I think
yes.
assist the delegate as they're contemplating this further.
Okay.
So Russell he's a registered RSci Tech.
Yes.
But it was suggested to him by an assessor that, you know, he should apply for RSci.
Yes.
And he's thinking, well, did I apply for the wrong status? And will he now have to submit a whole new application? And if he did resubmit, could he submit the RSci Tech application with editing, if you know what I mean? Or would he have to use completely new examples of competencies? No,
well, I can answer that. I can answer those 2 aspects very definitively. So let me just say to whoever it is, I was RSci, and then I quickly transitioned to CSci, and it's analogous for RSci Tech to RSci. How did I do that? I copied and pasted many of the same examples that I use in my RSci for my CSci report with some extra information. So likewise, you can do the same, but it will involve submitting a new application in the sense that you have to go through CAP again, but you can give the same examples that you used in your RSI Tech report and any others that have actually transpired since that time that you feel would bolster your application. So yes, in essence, at its core, you can use the same material.
Do you need to leave any time between applications?
No, you don't.
Okay.
You don't at all. What I'd say is that given that you, if for example, just to put that in some sort of context, Jane, and then I'll move on. If you had applied for an RSI Tech and it became evident to you subsequent to CAP, but before the award had been rendered, that in fact your RSI, it could complicate matters if you then put in another application, because in effect you'd have 2 CAP applications in the pipeline. However, if you're already RSI Tech, you could put your RSI in tomorrow.
Got it, I understand. Okay, great, Thank you.
Okay, so just to conclude this slide before we get on to the meat of the competencies, and this reaffirms the fact that this is not about academic scientific knowledge per se. Think laterally. Don't just focus on the lab duties I've mentioned, planning them, lab organization, working at the bench, maintaining equipment. Be transcendental in the sense that you can talk about other things with regard to communication and standards, which are the subject of competencies C and D, as we'll enunciate in a second, okay? So if you're involved in things like gender equality, equality and diversity initiatives, Athena Swan, technicians commitment, there are committees that tend to engender people from the top of the hierarchy to the bottom. So if you're involved in any of these, make them the subject of other competencies. And in particular, I would suggest competencies C and D. Okay, so I've mentioned the fact that there are these 4 canonical competencies that we're going to focus on, but each of those, and this is also true of CAP itself. I was once asked, and I'll bring this up at the outset, so there are 3 canonical competencies for each of the 4 main competencies we're going to talk about, but is there a separate field in terms of filling out your competency form for each, or do you combine them? And the answer is yes. And one of the reasons for that, apart from convenience, is the fact that you may choose different materials for each of these. So let's basically start with basically the short one. So develop sound knowledge for the application of science, apply concepts and techniques to new area, evaluate scientific information to troubleshoot and improve. So to basically, to try and summarize a little bit about what that's about, and I have additional examples here, that can be adapting a protocol if you're in the lab and you're adapting it for a new situation, or even for field work outside. It can be about optimizing a protocol. For example, if you're carrying out as a biomedical scientist PCR, if you're optimizing the conditions of the cycling reaction, if you're optimizing the primers, that's an example of the application of knowledge and understanding in an empirical sense. It can be troubleshooting a method if you have problems. That also applies, by the way, as I've mentioned, to the equipment itself. It's not just about pipetting at the bench. It's about new equipment methods, okay, optimizing the equipment. If, for example, you're adapting protocols for high throughput, you know, how do you go about that? That is a suitable subject suitable subject material for the application, knowledge and understanding. Then, of course, science isn't just about the experiments, whether they're automated or at the bench. It's about the output. It's about the data. And for example, the way that you analyze the data analysis protocols, that can be the subject of application of knowledge and understanding and improving things. The use of R to actually streamline data. Many experiments in labs involve statistical analysis. Have you altered the way that you analyze statistically? Okay, so anything like that. As I want to stress the fact that there are no right and wrong answers here. Okay, as long as it meets the pertinency, the key tenet of the competency, then that is fine. And let me illustrate that by basically bringing in something that hitherto I haven't discussed. So I've mentioned the application of knowledge and understanding in terms of experiments, but of course this could be written reports as well. Literature reviews, okay, for the experiments maybe you're going to do. That's an example of application of knowledge and understanding. That literature review might be carried out independently as an RSI. It may be carried out in association with a more senior member of the lab as an RSI tech, researching a new method, basically devising a new scientific method, researching that method. There are many user group forums today that are subject specific, and in fact technique, I should say, specific, such as sequencing. I'm sure there are others in the physical sciences as well that I don't know. I use one called ResearchGate. So for example, when I was thinking of working up a method that was completely new, application and knowledge and understanding to a novel situation, okay, I went online and I actually consulted worldwide with other users using this forum called ResearchGate. And many of us in this interconnected world actually confer with people in other labs who have done what we want to do and actually know all of the pitfalls. So if you've done something like that, done a literature review, worked up a method independently as an RSI or in conjunction with others as an RSI tech, and you've actually furthermore utilized these technical forums, there are many, for example, for next generation sequencing, then make that the subject of competency A in addition to any sort of empirical adaptations you've done as well. And at that point, I think I've talked about A in the context of this slide enough. And I'm going to basically hand over to you guys. So do any of you want to give me examples of reports you've written to work up a new techniques, adapting an existing technique, optimizing a technique such as PCR, improving data work through and analysis? Would any of you like to give me examples in your own sphere of work of what you think would fit competency A?
Don't be shy. Anybody want to give it a go?
No?
I guess I wouldn't have thought to include this sort of thing, but when you're talking about R, so if you've used R to like set up loops and automate analysis and just process mass amounts of data that you leave for a day, say, and then you come back and it's done, with that sort of thing?
Completely. In fact, I had one of the strongest RSI applications I've ever seen did just that. They talked about in this section the way that they'd used R to streamline protocols. So it's not even about improving on our algorithms. If you're learning R, for example, for the first time, you know it, but you're using it for the first time in the context of a data flow. So it's not about geeky stuff, you know, computer wizardry stuff of rewriting code. It's just about the actual learning and application of R to a new data cohort. Then yes, Nicola, that absolutely you could use that, and I've seen that used in RSI assessments that I've looked at.
Great, thank you.
Okay, any others? Who here has used bench techniques such as PCR and optimized PCR, a very ubiquitous thing? Biomedical scientists among you, have any of you done that? Generally, if you're doing PCR, you would basically try and tweak it for your particular conditions. Does anyone want to comment, or should I carry on? Okay, I'm going to carry on, but thank you for that, Nicole. So personal responsibility, okay, is the subject of competency B, and that's broken down into the specified sub-competencies. So how do you work autonomously? What are the limits of your autonomy? So remember, the bifurcation between RSI Tech and RSI is that an RSI Tech basically will work independently, but will confer with a more senior person. So the limits of their autonomy is they may not be able to troubleshoot. Okay. An RSI, by contrast, as I've said already, is someone that can actually jump through hoops by improvising or optimizing a standard technique. They may well have dependents, and by that I mean students that they train. Taking responsibility for safe working practice, that can be any safe working practice, but it generally, when I think about my own application, RSI and CSI, and I think about many others that I have actually assessed. Most people talk about COSH. So for example, if we delineate RSI Tech from RSI in the context of health and safety forms, COSH, RSI Tech would be expected to work safely in the lab, being mindful of COSH that they've been taught. So when they're taught, obviously, they're not just taught the technique itself, they're talked about safe laboratory practice, streaming the waste, etc. That's all good laboratory practice, safe working practice. Okay, so that would be something that you talk about as an RSI Tech. As an RSI, as part of the training that I've mentioned, you wouldn't just train somebody at RSI Tech level or a student in the lab. You would train them not just in the technique.
Hi.
Aye.
All good? You okay?
Is that okay? Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's fine, Lawrence. It was just some background.
Ah, okay. Yeah. So just to say that take responsibility for safe working practice, as an RSI, you would basically be training others, and you would also write the actual COSH forms that you would use to train your novice or RSI Tech. So promote and apply quality standards. That's other sorts of standards. That can be clinical standards such as HTA. It can actually be other sorts of structural standards. Planning your work is essentially how you go about planning your work, say as an RSI Tech individually. How do you actually manage your experiments, manage your time to meet the deadlines that your supervisor imposes? Planning work for an RSI, you're doing things a little bit more independently. So how do you respond to that? You may even be working on multiple projects. So how do you juggle the different projects? In the case of RSI as well, they're much more involved in actually optimizing methods for equipment, although RSI Techs may maintain equipment. So essentially planning work B4 is synonymous with juggling your total bench duties with your lab management duties, with your equipment maintenance duties. So there's obviously quite a lot going on, and it's how you actually plan all of that. So I'll say no more other than to put this in. So as I've said, this is about safe working practice, COSH, training others. It can be about improving, let me just go back. For example, one other standard that I haven't mentioned and has been brought up in a number of assessments I've seen. So you have COSH, you have other standards such as clinical standard, HTA, but even in a non-clinical lab, a lot of what goes on in a biomedical scientist lab is about aseptic technique. So what do you do? What have you done to actually improve the aseptic technique in your lab? You can actually talk about that. Okay. So before we move on to C, I have some other examples to mention. And in the case of B, planning can be for unexpected situations. So of course, unexpected situation can be maternity leave. You know, somebody actually talked about, as it's mentioned here, that their supervisor was going off to have a baby and they had to actually plan the work in the absence of their supervisor. But one that's very current and affects all of us, of course, is lockdown. I mean, there isn't a better example of an unexpected situation, how lockdown has impacted on the way that we work. So I'm going to say no more on the subject of lockdown because we all have our individual and respective stories. So would any of you like to talk a little bit about how lockdowns affected what you do? If you're, for example, based at home and you're now just actually working on Teams, working remotely on a computer. Maybe if you're a key personnel, you're expected to go in and maintain lab equipment, cryogenic storage, etc. Would any of you like to talk about how your responsibilities have changed as a result of lockdown? Okay, let me rephrase that. Are there any of you on this call who are key workers who have been asked to go in, and if so, why?
Hi there.
Hi.
So I've been asked to, so I'm one of the lab technicians at Edward Napier in the sports science labs.
Yes.
And we're now just slowly getting back to returning, and we've been the first, the technicians have been the first people back into the lab, as you would expect.
Yes.
So I've been asked to make sure that the facility is going to be safe upon returning. I suppose when it comes to lockdown, one of the things I think I could potentially use is, in the early days of lockdown, I first came across the Book It system as a potential solution for managing lab bookings when we returned back to the lab, and the university have decided to adopt that system now.
That is brilliant, Russell.
So would that be an example that you could use, for example?
That's an example par excellence. I mean, as I want to stress the fact, Russell, and to the rest of you, there are no right and wrong answers. You know, this isn't an objective scientific report. It's about finding examples which are pertinent and fit the competency. So depending on the way you worded that, Russell, that would be an excellent example, because anything in lockdown, anything you do, staying at home, working with teams, working on Zoom, going in, but some of the time, because you're a key worker, in order to actually render the facility safe for when we all return, or for the people that are already on site, but then spending the rest of your time maybe doing training courses at home. These are all pertinent examples of responding to an unexpected situation. So yes, yours, Russell, well written, would be as good as any I've heard. Okay, so that's really B. So what I'm going to talk about now is C and D. And in many ways, people find C the least confusing. One of the things that I'll mention in passing about the competencies and the subcompetencies thereof is there are subtle differences between the subcompetencies, such as, say, B1, B2, B3, not surprisingly, because they fall under the same heading. So people generally find that they get a little bit confused as to what these subtle differences are. The one sort of incontrovertible competency in terms of what candidates do, in my experience, is the interpersonal skills and communication, because it's really what it says on the tin. It's about effectively communicating with others. Okay, so effective communication skills in the context of RSci and RSci Tech, this first one, this is really dealing with specialists, okay? It's dealing with students, it's dealing with fellow technicians. These are people that are doing your job, and so in effect you can talk shop. But you notice the word effective, and I'll bring that up and I'll come back to this, because when you actually compose your competency answers, you need to select an example where what you've communicated has actually resulted in a solution, okay, or it's resulted in them demonstrably knowing something. So in that sense, it's effective, okay. Interpersonal skills and dealing with outside agencies, that's the way it's actually written for RSci and RSci Tech. That essentially is dealing with people other than your sort of counterparts in the lab. So, for example, as I mentioned earlier on, in our jobs, we stock take, we order, okay. We maintain equipment, okay. Some of us at RSci, not RSci Tech, are even involved in a little bit of budgeting. I was, but not always. So essentially, if you think about that, you're dealing with non-specialists, you're dealing with perhaps finance for one or two of you. All of you, however, regardless of your field, I suspect are dealing with things like medical reps. You're dealing with engineers if you're an RSci and you're expected to maintain your equipment, your automated platforms as part of your duties, okay? So you're dealing with people and you're speaking to them in a way that is quite different than you speak to your colleagues. Dealing with problems, okay? So this is another type of communication. And once again, just to illustrate the fact that you can take a particular theme and you can use it to answer multiple problems, an example, current example par excellence of dealing with problems, but it can be much wider than that, is of course lockdown. Okay. Problems caused in terms of our work patterns due to lockdown. So you could actually use lockdown as a theme for C3. So communicating specialist knowledge, stock taking and ordering. Equipment problems supplying equipment problems would be an example of another thing that we're dealing with outside of lockdown. Training others. And the only other thing I'd say before I moved on to D is the fact that it isn't just about your mode of communication, which is different when you're dealing with specialists. Moreover, specialists can be foreign students whose first language is in English, and I'll come back to that in a second. They can also, so you're dealing with students, you're dealing with fellow technicians. Some of those students may be foreign, so the way that you communicate is different, okay? The language that you use for dealing with non-specialists, okay, is a little bit different than if you're dealing with people in your own lab. Another example of that from my own personal experience is probably not RSci Tech, but there are one or two sort of articulate RSCs I've known who may be doing outreach projects in schools, okay? They might be giving tours in labs. The way that you communicate with non-scientific specialists on a lab tour, and I've done these, or outreach projects in schools is different, because effectively you pitch it at GCSE or A-level standard, okay? So the language you use to explain a concept would be different to a fellow scientist, okay? Finally, the one other thing I'll say before I move on to D, and I think we're doing pretty well for time, I think we'll finish bang on time, is it's the method of communication. So when I say communication, I'm not just talking about verbal communication. This could be the use of PowerPoint, presenting your results as an RSci to your colleagues in a lab meeting. I think RSci techs do that less, but not always, okay? So that's a mode of communication, okay? Dealing with problems by communicating by email. So it isn't just verbal communication and the language that you use, the syntax you use, it's the method of communication. And of course, one that's current at the moment, if we're going to talk about methods of communication, is many of us who are obliged until recently to stay at home, we're communicating with other students or our supervisors, usually either via Zoom or Teams. So bringing those virtual tools as well, which are particularly sort of germane at the moment. Okay. So do I have any other examples on my list? No. So I'm going to basically conclude with D. Okay, I'm just going to move up this menu bar, which always seems to be in the way. Okay, so let me take that back. So reviewing and selecting procedures, contributing to the organization of tasks and resources, improvement of change. So reviewing and selecting procedures. This can be about what I talked about in A. If you want to talk about experiments in A, if you're working up a new method, okay, that can be empirically at the bench. So I mentioned the fact that A is the primary scientific competency. There are aspects of actual talking shop that you can also incorporate into D. So for example, reviewing and selecting procedures. I remember supervising a student, training a student, where I was working up a gene expression method, and I had to decide on different types of materials to use. I had to decide on how we are to analyze the results or access the information online. Because when I talk about reviewing and selecting procedures, it's not just consumables in labs or the use of equipment. Many analytical procedures, such as gene expression, are done online using databases. So it could be, for example, if you're a biomedical scientist, and I'm sure there are equivalent examples in other fields that are other than life science, it could be that you're looking to basically work up a method to look at gene expression in particular systems. A lot of that information in terms of the genes itself is held on databases such as GenBank and Ensemble. So how do you go about working up a method, working up an SOP to put that into practice? And maybe it's an RSci to train somebody in that practice, okay? So that's an example of reviewing and selecting a procedure. It can be empirical at the bench with an instrument, without. It can actually be something online, some in silico procedure. Contribute to the organization of tasks and resources. Well, that's something, there are many examples, as I say, of that. Tasks, organization of tasks and resources, going back to my cartoon, when we're not at the bench performing experiments ourselves or on behalf of other people or training students, we're actually involved in lab management and lab housekeeping duties. As an RSI tech, you may be responsible for the upkeep of equipment, automated boxes, pH meters, etc. Whatever you find in your lab, okay, you'll contribute to the actual organization of that lab, the way it's actually organized with regard to other people, so it works properly, okay. And that can even be things like a reorganization of fridges and freezers in order to basically make them easier to use and to archive materials for yours and other experiments, okay. So that's contribution to organization of tasks and resources. Resources, of course, can be about time, they can be about money. So it could be, for example, that as an RSI, you actually look at alternative consumables, okay? And that really ties in with improvement and change as well. Perhaps you're doing something a certain way and you want to evaluate the competitors' materials, okay? That's a resource, the actual consumables you use in your experiments. Maybe you try others to see if it's cheaper, quicker, or better. Even as an RSI tech, whilst you may not be doing that completely independently, it could be that a senior member of the lab, the PI or a postdoc, is actually getting you to evaluate such materials. So as an RSI tech, you're conferring, but you're actually doing that as well. In terms of lab management, lab housekeeping, as I say, is part of organization, cleaning rotas, combining that with your lab work. As an RSI, you may be involved in more managerial things. What do I mean by that? It could be that you're actually devising lab rotas so that everyone in the lab is contributing to the upkeep of the lab. It could be that you have a big cleaning day and that you organize that in conjunction with a senior technician. These are all examples of technical and non-technical contribution to organization of tasks and resources. And some of those things obviously lead to improvement and change, okay? Those two are inextricably linked. So it could be that having reorganized the fridge, having reorganized stock, say as an RSI tech, that improves things. That's an example of improvement and change. So let me sum that up by saying that it can be about improvement and change can be about updating bench methods and equipment. It can also be about introducing new clinical standards. The Human Tissue Act mandates that. It can be, as I say, about evaluating in silico methods, such as the way that you analyze gene expression or something else which involves computational power. And obviously, as a physical scientist in particular, there's an awful lot of what you do, I imagine you do on the computer. It can be bench trials, wet trials. And I think at that point, I've covered that. So all I'll say is, so I'm basically mention a couple of others, okay? In terms of improvement, organization of resources, improvement and change, it could be that as a teaching technician, for example, that you're sharing equipment, you're sharing labs. So you have to actually alter the way you do things so that others can actually use that equipment. Maybe the lab is reorganized because of new groups coming in. These are all examples of organization and change and improvement. Could be that you're setting up a new lab from scratch. And basically that can be done by an RSI tech in conjunction with conversations with the PI. It could be done a little bit more independently. As an RSI, you might be procuring quotes, for example, for different pieces of equipment. These are all examples of improvement and change and contributing to organization of tasks and resources. Okay, so what I've done here, and this is really for you to reflect upon because we've got about 10 minutes and I think we'll finish on time. So what I've done here is I've tried to delineate RSI Tech and RSI for the examples really we've given, but I've tried to actually highlight seminal words. So an RSI would troubleshoot methods. That could be troubleshooting in terms of, as I've said, working up a method, in terms of a literature search, whereas an RSI tech would work according to an ascribed SOP. They've been trained by somebody else. You tend to follow COSH forms as an RSci tech, whereas you devise and train others with an RSci. You communicate your findings to your supervisor, maybe on a weekly or monthly basis as an RSci tech. You can do that verbally. You can do it using PowerPoint. So remember to talk about the modality in your answer. You'll do the same, obviously, as an RSci, but it may be as an RSci, you also have an opportunity to contribute your overall findings at lab seminars, or maybe devise posters and go to conferences. That's not unknown for an RSci. Okay, and then finally, we have D, and I'm just moving up the bar here. So housekeeping improvements in terms of an RSci tech, whereas more management type duties, working with others, basically delegating duties to others, such as PhD students, if you're an RSci, to keep the lab running.
So we've got a couple of questions, Lawrence.
Yep, we have time, Jane, just about.
So you're having arranged labs for social distancing over lockdown.
Yes.
Can that go into, would you put that into B or D?
Both. I mean, that's the thing. There are no right and wrong answers. You could actually take that subject material and you could put a different slant on it, and you could use it in B. You could use it in B or D, or B and D. And I've known people use either permutation, Jane. And
then how many examples do you think you should put in each section?
Okay, well, I'm actually coming to that at the end of the talk, but as that's a question, I would say for RSci Tech and RSci, it is okay to give one example structured well, and I'll come on to this in the last 5 minutes in the talk, which is about 3 minutes. But what I would say, particularly for RSci and RSci Tech, is as long as you've got one example that's comprehensively structured in the way I'm going to talk about 2 slides hence, that's sufficient. And certainly for RSci Tech, one comprehensively written out, detailed example is enough. But if you want to include 2 or 3, which I did, it doesn't harm. And the reason for saying that, and this is something I'll come back to, is the nature of science is such that in the last 5 years where we derive our examples, many scientists on temporary contract will have had 2 jobs. And perhaps they want to give an example from a previous job that fits that competency better, but then also come up to date and give another example from their current job. So generally, if you're mixing and matching examples from, say, 2 jobs in the last 5 years, most people in my experience, which includes me, I'm being autobiographical, will include 2 or 3. If you have a job that you've been in for quite a while and you can cover all the competencies, as long as they're different competencies, I would stress that, try not to recontextualize the same example and just give it once. I once failed an assessment for that reason, where they just talked about this fancy technique called CRISPR-Cas9 for editing genomes. So if you're going to use different examples, and particularly if you're RSci Tech, use 1. If you're talking about 2 jobs, maybe 1 to 2, 1 from each job. Does that answer the question?
I think that was very thorough. Thank you.
Okay, so I've talked about the fact that an RSci Tech will evaluate protocols with some conferring, that an RSci will do that independently. Nicole mentioned the fact, and I brought up the fact, that this isn't just about experimental input, it's about data output. So it can be about actually optimizing or introducing new experimental data analysis methods, such as R or other statistical methods, okay. Literature reviews, I've already covered that. So this doesn't have to be what you do at the bench. Okay. Responsibility, COVIDs, team or Zoom. I think I've already asked about that, so I'm not going to actually bring that back to the audience. So equipment, upkeep, rotas and methods. Okay. That's also part of your responsibility and part of basically planning or balancing your lab duties with your experimental project duties with your miscellaneous lab duties. Can I just say, in terms of communication, I mentioned in 1 slide the fact that, think laterally, think about things that you've done that are outside the remit of your lab and your general day-to-day job. And I mentioned Athena Swan. Are any of you here involved in the technician commitment? So what I'd say is that any sort of non-technical initiative that you might be involved in, obviously that's about broader communication to the university as a whole, equality and diversity, technicians' commitment. It can even be training you do online on Blackboard in that regard. You can talk about training courses. That's all an example of personal communication. Okay, here's one. Lockdown. I've basically come across people who, as a result of lockdown, students can feel isolated. And I've had an RSI, this is generally CSI, more managerial, but I have actually had an RSI that's been responsible for basically keeping an eye on their students from home. And there's been problems with students feeling isolated and consequent potential mental health issues as a result of lockdown. Do any of you deal with students or have dealt with students in a lockdown situation? Are any of you responsible for their sort of wider well-being? Would any of you like to comment on that? Or any of you involved in any such initiative? It's generally CSI, to be fair, and I'm getting nothing from the floor, so I will then just move on. Here's one that I find interesting. That's a very good example of communication skills par excellence. And I will comment on that if no one else does. So let me phrase this question in two ways. Have any of you actually, who are contemplating RSI, have any of you trained students whose first language is not English? And if so, what have been the challenges? Would anyone like to comment on that? Because I always think that communication style to effectively communicate with foreign students is a little bit different to native speakers. And that was something actually I spoke about in my own RSI and CSI competency report as part of my C answers. Do any of you here deal with foreign students, and what have been the challenges?
I think from my point of view, having a Scottish accent seems to lose a number of foreign students. So we developed some SOPs and video SOPs, which were the video SOPs were the ones that went down the best, that they have a resource there that they can always look back on. That comes with text, and we can change the language on the text if required for the students.
That sort of ties in rather nicely, Russell, with my own experience. I've supervised a lot of foreign students over the years. And I can think of one example of a very, very competent student from actually Iraq. He was from Baghdad. And ostensibly, and I use the word ostensibly because when you spoke to him, it wasn't obvious that he understood. But that's because his verbal communication was not that good. And in fact, he was taking in a lot more than I gave him credit for based on a prima facie sort of analysis of how he responded to what I said. And what I noticed was that if I wrote things down, which I did anyway, to make sure that what I'd said was reinforced, that he would actually then respond to me by email. And although it wasn't obvious that he actually understood from verbal communication I had with him, actually, based on his written communication, he'd understood a lot more than I give him in credit for. So the reason I mention this is it's about modality of communication. It's just what you've said, Russell, that whether it's an accent, whether it's a comprehension thing, there are different ways of communicating. There's the oral way and there's the written way. And think of examples in general of both, not just foreign students, of where you've deployed one effectively vis-a-vis the other. Okay, now I'm actually, because we're in the last 5 minutes, I'm going to go slightly over. I'm just going to move on to the last part of the talk, which is about structuring your answers. So stop problems, ordering improvements, that's about contribution to change, setting up a lab. These are all examples for you to look at if you actually get copies of my talk from myself or Jane. or the website. Assay design, working something up from scratch. That's something you can use in A, it's something you can use in D, and it's something indeed I use for both. So remember, take home message, common themes transcend the individual competencies. Okay, so I'm actually going to skip this because I want to get onto the last part, but this is just a slide for you to peruse where I show particular scenarios fitting particular competencies to illustrate the fact that a particular theme transcends more than one competency. And don't forget, in terms of communication, to talk about attending workshops, okay? Professional registration itself and attending this is an example of standards and communication, in fact, hence B and C, okay? If you're still in doubt whether you're RSci or RSci Tech, there actually is a register on the Science Council website, and you can find it at this web address here. Okay, so let's, in the last 5 minutes, I'm about 5 minutes now, let's just briefly talk about how you structure your answers. So I've given you examples of competencies for you to reflect on or recapitulate in your own answers. And as I say, this is the beginning of the process. I will offer you aftercare. I can give you, you can basically say, is this a good example? Yes or no. You can then commit pen to paper, and I will actually even précis your answers. I will mentor you. So coming back to what we were saying, for each of your sub-competencies, you want to write, I would say, about 300 to 500 words, okay? And that's in terms of reflective practice, okay? 1 to 3 case studies per category of reflective practice, although for RSci Tech, particularly if it's one job, 1 comprehensively written, and I'll talk about what that means in a second, is fine. You might want to mix and match from 2 jobs, in which case go for 2 or 3. And make sure they're taken from the last 5 years. The only other thing I'd say before I move on to the next slide is the fact that, you know, this is not an assignment, okay? You can take your time. In fact, you should take your time over this, okay? So take your time, reflect upon different competencies, change them, keep a record of what you do, draft it in rough, and then copy and paste it into the cap fields. Maybe change your mind in terms of the preliminary rough copy. So most people will spend 6 weeks doing this, but if you want to spend a year, because maybe perhaps you want to gain other skills that you think would go well to fit a certain competency, okay, and you need time to acquire the knowledge, the skills to actually do that, then spend a year, okay? So it's not an assignment, it's not time limited. So in terms of structuring an answer effectively and comprehensively, a competent answer, outline the problem or situation, okay, that you're going to talk about. That's your opening gambit, all right? Having identified a problem, what solutions did you pose? There are various solutions to a particular problem, okay? Talk about what solutions you posed, okay? Tell us why you did what you did and why you selected the particular one you did. Talk about outputs, okay? It's not enough to actually just talk about a problem that you've encountered. You did this to surmount that problem, but actually the method that you invoked was not effective. You've got to basically select an example for your competency where the actual methodology that you'd use, having identified an issue, worked it through with a particular methodology, results in success. There's a positive output, there's an outcome, okay? So you can sum that up as situation, task, action, result. So make sure, even if you just use one example, that it's actually structured in terms of STAR. And that one comprehensive example will be enough for the assessor. It's better that you give 1 than you give 2 with no outputs. So basically, the other thing is make sure it's autobiographical. Make sure your answers are replete with I and not we. It's got to be about you. Okay, and then the only other thing I'll basically refer you to is reference the heading. And by that, this is taken from the Science Council website. As I've mentioned, pay particular example to what you write for the sub-competencies, given that there are subtle differences. And if you want help with that, I will avail myself to you. So what happens at the end? We're coming to basically, we're pretty much at the end now. So having put together your competency report, okay, in a way that I've enunciated, it's assessed by 2 assessors who are registered scientists themselves or CSI as I am, and it's assessed blind to make sure there's no bias. If the 2 assessors basically agree, and for a comprehensively written report confirming to the tenets of STAR, you know, what I refer to as competent competency answers, generally, but not always, generally the assessors tend to agree, okay? And so they will get back to you usually within about 3 weeks. Obviously, the thing that holds it up for a report that is well written and is therefore ratified by both assessors is the time it takes for the second assessor. So this is basically a voluntary thing, assessment. So assessors will do this in their free time. One may return a verdict within 3 or 4 days. I'm on lockdown, so I'm turning them around very fast. The fellow assessor, however, might take 3 weeks. And if they concur, you will be basically awarded, therefore, your register in 3 weeks. If they don't concur, then it has to go back to the candidate. The main reason they don't concur is a lack of detail. This is the main reason that assessors bounce things back to candidates. You know, you've written about this, but you've really just outlined it. You haven't actually talked about your actions comprehensively. Okay. So as I say, it's rare for somebody to fail outright. Assessors will work with you in concert with Hayley to try and pep up your report. Okay. And let me mention before I close that be careful and be mindful, therefore, of the register that you select, because if you go for RSI and it's not up to scratch and you cannot make it up to scratch with mentoring and comments from your assessors, then you won't be awarded RSI Tech as a consolation prize. So select what you do carefully, and moreover, take your time with the report to the extent that defer cap until you know that you have every good examples of every requisite competency. Take your time, as I say. Okay. So briefly, it's the default is 1 reference and therefore 1 job in the last 5 years. However, I've had many situations, my own included, we're nearly done, where I've had a prior job in the last 5 years where I select examples from a previous job that more exemplify a particular competency. So you mix and match from the last 5 years. And that last 5 years, and that 5-year span, or that second position within the 5 years, it can be voluntary work. It doesn't have to be paid work. What I would say, the only caveat I'd make is if you are going to mix and match competencies from 2 positions, voluntary or otherwise, you need to contact Hayley about procuring a second reference. The default is 1 referee. Okay, so these are just the Science Council registrant standards that I've put in here because I'm obliged to. So basically a registrant must seek to ensure their CPD has contributed to the quality of their practice, it's up to date, it benefits the users of the service, and also that they must present a written profile containing evidence of their CPD upon request. But that's generally once you're actually on the Science Council register. It's post application. These are extended competency report notes for RSI and RSI Tech respectively. That's the actual link I provide at the beginning, so you could actually enter CAP from there. This is a video guiding you through what I've said, how to structure answers, and that's actually a link. There's no real substitute for seeing competency reports themselves. I can basically work with you. I can provide you with examples that you can recapitulate, but there's no substitute for real answers. So I will avail my own competency report to you. And in fact, if you get a copy of that talk, that's a link to an archive on Google where you can access my own RSI report. accessory materials from the IST. All professional bodies have them. Basically, something about the mechanics of CAP that's primarily covered in Talk 1, but I thought I'd add it to support materials here, and that is it. So it basically gives you an iteration of how you start and how you go through your application and how you submit. And at that point, because we're about 5 to 10 minutes over, I'm going to stop. So I'm actually now going to stop my share and turn over to you guys and say, do you have any questions? Anyone like to, any concluding remarks, any comments?
So Russell has said his thank you. Yeah, sorry, come on in.
No, that's okay. I was just going to say thank you very much for your time and help. It was very informative, and it's answered all of my questions. So thank you.
Oh, that's nice to know. Answered all of your questions. Well, if that's not a good endorsement, Russell, I don't know what is. But keep in mind, just let me say before we go, if that's really the end of the chat, that this, from my point of view, is the beginning of our mutual journey. If you want to drop me a line, if you want to have a go at drafting based on what I said, and just say, look, Lawrence, if you assess this, what do you think? Is it relevant? Is it structured according to STAR? Would you pass this? I shall avail myself of that request now. So keep that in mind, and you have my email address at the Science Council.
Thank you very much, Lawrence. That's above and beyond, so thank you.
Oh, you've made my day. Answered every question and above and beyond. What a ringing endorsement, Russell. That's going to put me in a good mood for the rest of the day.
Thank you. Cheers.
Okay. Bye, everybody, then. So if I can just have a word with you, Jane, after this ends, if that's all right. So I'll let everyone else go.
Yeah.
I think Russell's just going off. Yep, I think we're by ourselves.
Okay.
Yeah, I thought that went well, Jane, by cutting out the CPD. I was slightly over, but you never know what the audience participation is. And that obviously is going to, I think the main thing is that you don't go drastically over and you allow them to come in and contribute when they can. So I would say on balance, Jane, that went well.
Yeah, yeah, no, it did. Very good.
All I wanted to say, Jane, was you saw my apologies, Jane. This is unrelated. It's what I talked about yesterday.
Okay.
So just when you thought that it couldn't get more improbable than lockdown, our plumber died of septic shock. So that sent myself and Caroline into a whirl, and we've had to both scramble to try and keep the job on track because we're moving out in 6 weeks.
Okay.
And that's the reason, Jane, that I haven't done the CPD, not the CPD, the confidentiality training. You probably noticed I logged on, wasn't able to log on, and then they identified a fault, got back to me and you, and claimed they fixed it, Jane. But when I tried about 8 o'clock last night to try and get going with it, or at least give myself a measure of the lay of the land, I was unable to log on. So what I'll say, Jane, is this afternoon, I will try again. I will try this time from my Windows computers because sometimes you get odd things with Macs. So I'll try it from my Windows computer. And if I still cannot log on with my Science Council email address, I'll drop them a line and obviously, Jane, try and work with them such that I can get this done today or tomorrow.
Okay, that'd be great.
Yeah.
So I had the same issue.
And how did you solve it, Jane?
Well, they solved it with me, basically. So
okay.
You'll need to solve it with Abdul.
I'll need to solve it with Abdul. Thank you.
Yeah, he did. I don't know. I just kept telling him and going back and telling him, and he said, "That's really odd. I can see that your account expires in June 2021.
Right.
But when I look at it, it says June 2020.